Good afternoon. My name is Bob Norman, and on behalf of the York County Historical Committee, I'd like to welcome you to our presentation this afternoon. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Jonathan W. White. Dr. White is Professor of American Studies at Christopher Newport University. He holds a PhD and MA from the University of Maryland in College Park, and a BA in American History from Penn State University. He's the author or editor of some 17 books and over 100 articles, reviews, and essays about the Civil War. A recent book titled A House Built by Slaves won the prestigious Gilder Lehrman Award, or prize rather, for 2023. Many of you attended his excellent lecture on that topic recently. His new book, Shipwrecked, is the subject of today's presentation. Professor White is also a distinguished lecturer for the Organization of American Historians. He serves on the boards of directors of several organizations devoted to Abraham Lincoln. In 2019, he was selected as the Outstanding Faculty Award, or for the Outstanding Faculty Award of the State Council of Higher Education in Virginia, which is the highest award given to faculty in the Commonwealth. Professor White will be available following the lecture in the lobby downstairs to sell and sign not only this book, but some others as well. Now that we know a little bit about him, I'm going to turn it over to Professor Jonathan White.
Thank you, Bob. And for those who are standing in the back, there's 2 seats here if you want to be part of the show, and there's a few others spread out just so you don't have to stand the whole time. I'm really pleased to be here again. It's so nice to see some familiar faces and to be back here. I think it's been about 2 years since I spoke about A House Built by Slaves. Before I turn to the topic of today, I'm going to do a quick little sales pitch. I just published my 17th book on February 1st, and it's a children's book called My Day with Abe Lincoln. And if you look around the room, you can see that the average age is slightly above 35, maybe 40. And one of the things that we're always trying to figure out is how to get young people interested in history. And I've got 2 little girls, and Drake and Christian know my girls from our church. And this is Charlotte and Clara here. And over the last couple of years, I've been writing this book about a 3rd grade girl who doesn't want to go to school one day. And so she throws a tantrum and does something that causes her to travel back in time and meet a young Abraham Lincoln in the 1820s. And she goes to school with him and learns all about his life, and then comes back to the present a changed person, interested in reading, interested in learning. It may be a little too fantastical, but I tell people all of it is 100% historically accurate except for the time travel part. That's the only part I made up. So if you're interested, I have copies of that as available as well. Makes a wonderful gift for grandkids. All right, so now I'm going to talk about Shipwrecked, a book that I published in August. And I'm going to actually start by talking about someone who's a minor character in my book. But to do that, let me turn this on. To do that, I've got to go back to the very beginning of our nation, to the U.S. Constitution. The Constitution avoided using the words slave or slavery, but it had 3 provisions that had to do with slavery. James Madison said the reason they didn't use that word, slave or slavery, is that they didn't want the Constitution to embody the words that would have the idea of property in man. So as Lincoln said, they kind of hid it away. And one of the places where they hid it away was a clause that was very convoluted in its language, but essentially meant or said that Congress could not abolish the transatlantic slave trade for 20 years. But if it wanted to, after 20 years, they could abolish the slave trade from the west coast of Africa. And this was a compromise measure. White Southerners in the Deep South, places like Georgia and South Carolina, they wanted the slave trade to continue. They wouldn't join the Union unless they could get some sort of compromise on this issue. Northerners and people in the Upper South recognized the pure evil of the Middle Passage, and so they compromised. They said, we'll give it 20 years, and if Congress wants to, it can abolish the slave trade, but it doesn't have to. Well, the summer of 1807, Congress passed a law abolishing the transatlantic slave trade. Thomas Jefferson was president. He signed it into law, and effective January 1st, 1808, the slave trade is illegal from the west coast of Africa to the United States. But just because something is illegal doesn't mean that people don't do it. And so people continued to participate in the slave trade in the years following the passage of this law. And so in 1820, they passed a new law that actually declared slave trading to be piracy. So now it's a capital offense. You could be executed for this crime. But again, people continue to participate in the slave trade. And this is an 18th century abolitionist image that was used to show the inhumanity of the Middle Passage. And you can see the human beings who were stuffed below decks and forced into very terrible conditions as they're going to make a long passage across the Atlantic Ocean. And here was the dirty little secret. Even though slave trading was illegal, even though it was piracy and a capital offense, nobody was ever punished for it to the full extent of the law from 1808 all the way up to the years of the Civil War. What would often happen is the prosecutors would not sequester the jury, and the jury would have enough members who were bribed so that someone would be either acquitted or have a hung jury, or the jailers or the U.S. Marshals would accept bribes and allow people to escape. No one ever faced the full punishment of slave trading. But that would change when Lincoln became president. Now, the first story I'm going to tell involves a man named Nathaniel Gordon. Nathaniel Gordon was from Portland, Maine. Believe it or not, many of the slave traders in American history were New Englanders, and many of the slave trading ships were built in New England, and so Nathaniel Gordon was from Portland. He participated in at least 3 or 4 slave trading voyages during the 1850s. Those were in and out of Brazil and Cuba. And in August of 1860, he found himself on the west coast of Africa, commanding a ship called the Erie. And on one particular day in August of 1860, he loaded 897 Africans on board his ship. Most of them were women and children. None appeared to be older than 40. Some appeared to be as young as 6 months old. He was going after the weakest of the weak. He bought them by trading whiskey to the people on the coast of Africa who had been holding these people in prison, and he loaded them onto his ship in a mere 45 minutes. He was a very skilled person at this trade. And Nathaniel Gordon had a bladed knife or weapon of some sort that he used to cut off the remnants of clothes that the men and women were wearing, and then he would use that knife to direct them, the men to one side of the ship and the women to the other, before they would go below decks into just utter squalor and filth and disease. So 45 minutes takes place, he loads up this cargo of human beings, and they set sail. And as they within a few hours of setting sail into the Atlantic Ocean, they see a ship in the distance. And at that point, Gordon had a decision to make. When he saw the ship, he had to decide, do I think it's a British ship or do I think it's an American ship? Because under the treaties at that time, the British were not allowed to search American ships, and the Americans were not allowed to search British ships. And so he had to take a gamble. Do I think this is British or American? Because if it's a British ship, I'll run up the American flag and they won't be able to search my ship. If I think it's an American ship, I'll run up the British flag and they won't be able to search. And so he took a gamble. He ran up the American flag, and it just so happened to be an American ship. And so they were allowed to search him. They went on board, and they found the 897 people below decks. And this is not a photograph of those particular Africans, but these are other Africans who were rescued in the mid-19th century. And you can see all of the children who are sitting in the front and the women in the background. Again, these slave traders were going after the weakest of the weak. Well, the Africans were sent to Liberia, which was a colony that had been established for Africans and African Americans, and I can talk more about this in the Q&A if you're interested. Quite sadly, many of them would die along that very long journey to Liberia, and because they were very dark-skinned, they were actually treated very badly by light-skinned African Americans who had settled there. So they would never see their families again, and many would die along the way. Very tragic ending to their stories as part of this story. Nathaniel Gordon was put onto a U.S. Navy ship and sent to New York. New York was the financial hub of the slave trade in the world by 1860. and it's the commercial center and the financial center of the United States. And many maritime cases are tried in New York in that time. And so Nathaniel Gordon is sent to New York City, and he is imprisoned in what we would call a minimum security prison. And he knew he had nothing to fear, because the president at that time was a Pennsylvania Democrat named James Buchanan. James Buchanan is what was known as a doughface, meaning he was a Northern Democrat who had Southern principles. So he was pro-slavery. They said they would call these people doughfaces because it's like they were pliable. They could be easily manipulated. And so Nathaniel Gordon knew he had nothing to fear because James Buchanan is president, and his prosecutor and U.S. Marshal are going to be in charge of the trial. At one point, the prosecutor offered Gordon a plea deal, and he was so confident that he would not be punished that he turned the deal down. And for a $50 bribe, the jailer would allow Gordon out of prison, and he could have fancy dinners in Manhattan, someone said, like a gentleman. He was just strutting around the streets of lower Manhattan. But then, and he went to trial, and his first trial ended in a hung jury. And it is almost certainly because some of the jurors were bribed. But then Abraham Lincoln became president, and Lincoln pledged his administration to destroying the transatlantic slave trade. In May of 1861, Lincoln told his Secretary of the Interior, "You will do this," and he had his State Department working with the Interior Department to destroy the slave trade. And they decided to go after Nathaniel Gordon a second time. He wasn't acquitted in the first trial, so it's not violating his right of double jeopardy. So now they move him from a minimum security prison to what we would today consider a maximum security prison, a place in lower Manhattan known as the Tombs. And he's thrown in here. He's no longer allowed to walk around town. And they have a new prosecutor who's been appointed by Lincoln, and they decide that they're going to go after him again. And his second trial takes place in November of 1861. This time they sequestered the jury so that no one could be bribed, and this time he gets convicted and sentenced to be executed. Now, you might think, depending on your view of capital punishment, you may think that this is a great moment in the history of morality in this country, that finally someone who participates in one of the most heinous forms of commercial practice that you could do is finally going to receive the punishment that he deserves. And yet, thousands and thousands and thousands of Northerners wrote to Lincoln pleading for pardon. This is a petition from Nathaniel Gordon's hometown of Portland, Maine. It was signed by almost 200 people. And you're probably not going to be able to make out the words up there, but the import of it is, Nathaniel Gordon has a really nice mom and sister and wife and young child and lots of good friends. And so you shouldn't execute him because he has all these really nice women around him in his life. Other people wrote to Lincoln and said, you know, no one ever thought that Nathaniel Gordon would be punished for this crime, and it wouldn't be right to execute him because he never saw it coming. And other people said, you know, this shows that we can get a conviction. We don't need to execute him because the lesson has been learned, and now people will stop participating in the slave trade. At one point, the execution was set for early February 1862. And Nathaniel Gordon's wife and mother rushed to Washington, D.C. to meet with the president. And Lincoln refused to meet with them. At this point in Lincoln's life, he is dealing with some really tragic things on a personal level and on a political and military level. On the personal level, his two young sons were very sick. They had drank water that was contaminated out of the Potomac River, and one of them was dying. Willie Lincoln was 11 years old. He would be dead before the end of the month. His other son would recover. So Lincoln is struggling personally with this great hardship. At the same time, Lincoln is trying to get George B. McClellan to move from Fort Monroe up to capture Richmond. And as you all know, George B. McClellan wasn't really very good at advancing militarily. And so Lincoln is really frustrated politically with McClellan. And so he's got all of this going on personally and politically, and Lincoln just says, I cannot meet with these two women. They can talk to Mary Lincoln. And so they meet with his wife and give her a poem that's about how wonderful Nathaniel Gordon is. And Mary goes to her husband and says, why don't you do something here? And Lincoln says no. But Lincoln thought about it, and he came up with what he saw as a compromise plan. In early February, he wrote out a 2-week stay of execution, a respite. He essentially said Nathaniel Gordon, in Lincoln's words, needs to make necessary preparation for the awful change which awaits him. I love that. It's pure Lincoln, the awful change. That's an old understanding of awful, that God is awesome. And Gordon is about to meet his maker, and he better prepare himself before he gets to that place. And Lincoln closed this stay of execution with the line that you can see there, although you probably can't make it out because it's very faded. So I'll tell you what he wrote. Lincoln said, "In granting this respite, it becomes my painful duty to admonish the prisoner that relinquishing all expectation of pardon by human authority, he refer himself alone to the mercy of the common God and Father of all men." You see, Nathaniel Gordon believed that Africans and their descendants were nothing more than articles of merchandise, to quote the Supreme Court in Dred Scott, to be bought and sold whenever a profit could be made. For Nathaniel Gordon and other slave traders like him, Africans and African Americans were subhuman. They didn't have rights. Lincoln wanted Gordon to reflect for the last 2 weeks of his life that they were human beings made in the image of God who deserved dignity and respect. Well, Nathaniel Gordon had 2 weeks to think about it. And the night before his execution, someone snuck in some poison. They hid it in a cigar. And Nathaniel Gordon did not want to go to the gallows, so in the middle of the night, he broke open the cigar and took the poison, and the guards heard him writhing in pain. And they rushed into his cell, and they saw what had happened, and so they would not allow him to cheat the gallows. They summoned a doctor who came in and pumped his stomach. He vomited out everything that was in there, and they kept him alive until the next morning. And they walked him to the gallows. They had to practically carry him because he was so weak at this point. We don't know how many people were there, somewhere between 50 and 400, the estimates vary, but they were there to watch him executed. This was the first and only slave trader in American history to receive the full punishment for slave trading. And it was Lincoln taking a stand and showing the American people and the world that he would enforce the law against enslaving Africans and transporting them illegally to the United States. Now, the Gordon story is fairly well known among Lincoln scholars and Civil War buffs. There's a biography of Gordon that was written by a friend of mine about 20 years ago. So a lot of people have known Nathaniel Gordon's story. And about 6 or 7 years ago, I decided I was going to write a history of the slave trade during the Civil War. And so I was going to have a chapter on Nathaniel Gordon, and then I was going to have chapters on other slave traders that I knew about. And I had a student at Christopher Newport University who was my summer research assistant. And one day, I gave him a list of names, and I said, I want you to go onto newspapers.com and see what you can find about all these people, because I know they were slave traders. And so he goes and he starts searching, and then one day he comes into my office, and he says, have you ever heard of Appleton Oaksmith? And I said, no, why? And he said, well, his name keeps coming up in all of these searches that I'm doing, all these newspaper articles. And so I thought, wow, Appleton Oaksmith. I mean, if I had heard of that name, I wouldn't have forgotten it. And so I told Daniel, I said, well, do some more searching on him. And I thought I'll have a chapter on Oaksmith in my book. But the more I researched, the more I realized his story was one that was worth a book of its own. And so I actually got rid of the idea of writing a large history of the slave trade. I kept my chapter on Nathaniel Gordon. I didn't want to lose all the work I had done there. But then I ended up turning it into a biography of this little-known sea captain that I called Shipwrecked. And so now I'm going to tell you his story, and you'll be able to see how it fits into this broader history of the Civil War and also the slave trade. Appleton Oaksmith was born in Portland, Maine, to a very prominent woman named Elizabeth Oaksmith. Elizabeth Oaksmith was part of the first wave feminist movement in the 1840s and 50s, and I am convinced that if the story I'm about to tell you didn't happen, we would know who she was today in the same way that we know who Susan B. Anthony is. She was that prominent in her day. As a very young woman, you might even say a girl, 16 years old, her mother married her off to a man in his 30s. His name was Seba Smith. Seba Smith was a journalist in Maine. And Elizabeth Oaksmith and Seba Smith, I believe, had a happy marriage at first, But she grew to resent him over the course of their marriage. He was something of a loafer. She ended up supporting their family to a large extent by the 1850s and 1860s. And by the 1880s, at the end of her life, she wrote back with great disdain about her wedding day, how she was defrauded of her youth, being married at 16 to a much older man who was 33. I would kill to be 33 again. And she said, who was very bald. And I just need to pause for a second, because this picture is from 1860, 30 years after their wedding, and I would kill for a head of hair like that. So her memory may not have been perfect. He was not very bald when they got married. But at any rate, he was a prominent journalist in the 1830s, and he created a character that some of you may have heard of named Jack Downing. Jack Downing was a fictional advisor for Andrew Jackson, who would travel from Maine down to Washington, D.C., and give Andrew Jackson advice as president. And every issue of his newspaper, he would write these letters from this guy named Jack Downing, who would give political advice. And it was very funny. And it didn't matter what political party you were, whether you were a Whig or a Democrat. Everyone in America loved the Jack Downing stories. So Andrew Jackson, a Democrat, loved Jack Downing stories. Abraham Lincoln, a Whig, as a guy in his 20s, loved the Jack Downing stories. And so Appleton Oaksmith is born into this family with two very prominent literary parents. And by the late 1840s, the marriage is starting to deteriorate. And Elizabeth is a very popular writer in New York City. They're living in New York by this time. Edgar Allan Poe is a big fan of hers, Horace Greeley, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, they all love her work. And Elizabeth would go to literary soirees that were run by a very prominent, wealthy, attractive young woman named Anna Lynch. And because the marriage was deteriorating, Seba Smith would not go with his wife, so Elizabeth would take her sons instead. And so when Appleton got old enough, he would escort his mother to these very fancy soirees where they would meet famous people. And I can't prove it, but I think that Appleton and this woman, Anna Lynch, fell in love. But for some reason, it didn't work out. And the reason I think it was her, in his journal, he describes falling in love with a woman who he just called L, and that's her initial. And then it fell apart. And so he had to leave New York. He had to have some sort of rebound. And so he gets on a boat, and he heads around the coast of South America, and he makes his way all the way to San Francisco. And he gets there in 1850, and this is the height of the gold rush. And when he gets there, he finds that San Francisco is rife with crime. And not only is there a tremendous amount of crime, but there's a lot of arson, and people are just burning San Francisco down time after time after time. And so a group of local citizens formed themselves into what they called the San Francisco Vigilance Committee. And they were basically going to take the law into their own hands and try to arrest and try and execute people who were participating in the arson and other crimes. And for a short while, Appleton Oaksmith participates in this vigilance committee, but after a little while, he realizes he doesn't really feel comfortable with this sort of extra-legal judicial process. And so he resigns from the vigilance committee. And he leaves San Francisco. He had thought when he got there that he would spend the rest of his life there, but it just wasn't working for him. And so he acquires a ship called the Mary Adeline, and he takes on some passengers, and he heads back down the coast around South America, and he's heading back towards New York. Now, Appleton's plan was to somewhere along that journey find a cargo that he could take back to New York, and that way he's making money while he's sailing. But he could never find one. People try to sell him all sorts of crazy things. He kept a journal during this whole time, and at one point he stopped somewhere in South America, and they say, the soil causes people to become mummies. You should buy these mummies and take them back to the United States. They'll be great. And Appleton wants nothing to do with buying mummies. Eventually, he makes his way to Rio, and when he gets to Rio, the Brazilian government fires on his ship because he's a strange vessel, and he somehow gets through that cannonading, makes it into Rio. He travels around the city for a while, and eventually he finds a Portuguese firm that says, we have a cargo, but it's bound for the west coast of Africa. And having nothing else that can make him any money, Appleton agrees to take on that cargo and some of the Portuguese merchants. And so they get on his ship, and they head out. They head east on the Atlantic Ocean, and it takes a long time, but eventually they make it to the Congo River. And when they get to the Congo River, there are British ships of the British Africa Squadron that are patrolling looking for slave traders. And remember from the story of Nathaniel Gordon, an American ship did not have to allow the British on board. But Appleton Oaksmith allowed the British onto his ship, and presumably they looked around and didn't see any evidence of slave trading, and they shared conversation together, and then the British went on their way. Well, Appleton eventually made it onto the Congo River, but the current was very, very strong, and his ship got beached right around the curve of the Congo River at a place called Shark's Point. And at that point, 3,000 African warriors see his ship stuck on the shoreline, and they attack him with guns that they've filled with rocks and shells and other shards of metal. And Appleton is a sitting duck at this point. He and his men are just sitting ducks. They have no way to fight back. And the British sailors who had searched his ship a few days earlier see this, and they come and give him a cannon and fire towards the African warriors on the shoreline. They unload his cargo so that the ship becomes lighter and he eventually becomes free. Now, we don't know exactly what was going on in this moment, but presumably the Africans believed he was a slave trader, and they were worried that he was going to kidnap them, and so they tried to kill him, which would be perfectly understandable from their perspective. This moment made international headlines, and newspapers around the Atlantic world reported on what they called the Battle of the Congo. Appleton was just thrilled to make it out of there alive. He headed west across the Atlantic Ocean back to America, and he returned to his home in New York City. In the 1850s, Appleton became involved in a number of other sort of plots that are very famous. He became the right-hand man of a guy named William Walker, who tried to seize Nicaragua and turn it into basically an extension of the United States as a pro-slavery nation. He became involved in the fight for Cuban liberation from Spain. And in these two escapades, Appleton Oaksmith lost a tremendous amount of money. And by the end of the 1850s, he was flat broke. He also, at this time, happened to meet a woman named Isata Rebeccini, and after knowing her for 10 days, he decided to get married. And I'll tell the couple of young people in the crowd, it's usually not a good idea to marry someone after knowing them for only 10 days, but that's what he did. And this would wind up being a very turbulent relationship, as you'll hear in a couple of minutes, and his wife and his mother utterly despised each other, something we've never heard of, wives and mother-in-laws not getting along. So now we're at the end of the 1850s. Appleton is flat broke. His wife has had a couple of children, and he and his brother and his brother's wife and all their kids are all pretty poor at this point. So what do? They move in with mom and dad. Some things never change. And so they're living all in one house on Long Island, and they're trying to figure out a way to make money. And so they start a magazine called the Great Republic Monthly. And their hope was maybe this is how we can strike it rich. But that didn't pan out either. Come the election of 1860, Abraham Lincoln's elected president, the South starts to secede, and Appleton gets involved in New York City Democratic politics. And he tries to put on grand, massive union meetings to support the union and oppose secession, but nothing he does goes anywhere. And in early 1861, again needing money, he finds a job working with a fish oil factory owner on Long Island. And the fish oil factory owner and Appleton decide, you know what we really need? We need whale oil. And I don't fully understand why they thought they needed this, but they thought, we're going to get some ships, and we're going to go out and hunt whales, and we're going to bring the oil back, and we'll use it in the fish oil factory. Now, getting into the whaling business in 1861 was a very suspicious thing, because petroleum had been discovered in Titusville, Pennsylvania in 1859. And over those intervening 2 years, the whaling industry completely bottomed out. And so no one was getting into the whaling industry at the beginning of the Civil War. But here's Appleton Oaksmith going around New Bedford, Massachusetts, and New York City, trying to find old whaling ships, and he finds some people in New York who will sell him a ship. And they sell the ship to him, they take his money, and then they immediately go to Lincoln's prosecutor and U.S. Marshal in New York City, and they say, hey, this guy just bought a ship from us, and we think he's going to be on a slaving voyage instead of a whaling voyage. You should arrest him. And so the U.S. Marshal is persuaded and goes and arrests Appleton Oaksmith. And he throws him into a fort called Fort Lafayette. And this is the fort is no longer standing. This is what it looked like. It's now where there's a bridge that goes across the East River where this used to stand. And we know what cell he was in, and this is an image of his cell. He was in a casemate. So if any of you have been to the Casemate Museum at Fort Monroe, you kind of have a sense of what this guy was imprisoned in. And they arrested him and they held him. They actually they didn't have evidence to charge him with slave trading, so they arrested him on suspicion of being disloyal. No one suspected him of really being disloyal, but they needed a pretense to arrest him. So they arrest him on disloyalty, they throw him in this casemate, and they hold him there for several weeks. And meanwhile, the wife and mother-in-law, his mom, begin actually for the one time in their life working together to try to get him released. And so this is a letter that Elizabeth Oaksmith sent to Abraham Lincoln, asking, she sent him one of Appleton's poems, and she tried to get Lincoln to intervene in this case. And then this is a letter that his wife wrote on the same day to Lincoln. The letter from his mother is housed in the Lincoln Papers at the Library of Congress. And that's significant because the papers at the Library of Congress are the ones that meant something to Lincoln, that he kept, that didn't just get farmed out to the federal bureaucracy. And it tells us that Abraham Lincoln almost certainly knew who Elizabeth Oaksmith was. The letter from Isata is just in this massive record group at the National Archives. Lincoln didn't care about that one. So Appleton is sitting in prison in Fort Lafayette. His wife and mother are pleading with the Lincoln administration to let him go, but they will not do it. In fact, they have different plans. They worry that they can't get a conviction in New York City. This is before Nathaniel Gordon has gotten his conviction. But they think they can get one in Boston. And they know he had bought old whaling ships in Boston. So they transfer him up to Fort Warren in Boston Harbor, which you can still visit today. And they imprison him there. And Appleton at this point doesn't know what he's being charged with. He doesn't know what the accusation is. He just knows he's been moved. When he gets up there, he is housed with the members of the Maryland State Legislature who had been suspected of secessionism. And they don't like him because he's suspected of being a slave trader, and so they won't talk to him. But the one time they do get along is on Christmas night. All of the political prisoners hated Abraham Lincoln's Secretary of State, William Seward, who you see pictured here. And so on Christmas night, they got a lot of eggnog, and it's not the kind you can buy at Harris Teeter. I mean, it was very potent stuff. And they hold a treason trial for Seward, and they made an effigy of him, and they put him on the stand, and they all testified against him, and they found him guilty of treason, and they executed him. And one of the Maryland prisoners wrote about this in his diary, and he said, there was a guard who was watching us, and we were a little worried that we might get in trouble for this later, but the guard had so much eggnog that he passed out, and they figured he would forget by the next morning what he had witnessed. Well, finally, in January of 1862, an order comes to release Appleton from prison, and he thinks he's finally going to be free again. But he has a rude awakening waiting for him. When he gets out of the prison walls, out of the fort's walls, there are the U.S. Marshal and the U.S. Attorney, and they promptly arrest him under civil authority. And I'll just make a quick side note here. Some of you may recognize the name of the U.S. Attorney, Richard Henry Dana, Jr. Many of you may in college have read a book called 2 Years Before the Mast. He is the very famous sailor who wrote that book 30 years before this. So they arrest him and they take him to the Charles Street Jail. And the Charles Street Jail is actually a luxury hotel today. At the time, it was a state-of-the-art prison. It was only 11 years old. Now you can go there, and for $600 or $700 a night, you can stay in an old jail cell. I can't quite afford to stay there. And they hold him in this prison, and they bring him into court. And Richard Henry Dana accuses Appleton Oaksmith of being the head of a giant, enormous slave trading ring, and calls for bail, for either no bail or a very high bail. And Appleton says, I have no money, I'm flat broke. And the judge says, okay, I'll give you a moderate bail, a modest bail. I think it was about $5,000. And Appleton couldn't come up with that kind of money, and so he went back to prison. Well, in June of 1862, he goes to trial. And he couldn't find a lawyer to represent him, and so he got his uncle. And another good principle is never represent yourself and never have a relative represent you. And his uncle, the best defense his uncle could really muster, and maybe this says something about whether, I don't know for sure whether or not Appleton was guilty. He was, in a sense, if he was caught before he did anything. But the best defense that his uncle/lawyer could come up with was to get 13 women and girls and seat them around him while he's at the defense table. And the hope was that that would appeal to the jurors' sympathies, because of course it was an all-male jury at that time. And so you've got his daughters and his sister-in-law, who you see pictured here, and his mother and some other women, we don't know who they were, and they're just sitting there, and hopefully the jury will fall for this. And if that's not enough, his sister-in-law, Fanny, goes to take the stand, and while she's testifying, she passes out. And they had orchestrated this, I believe, because Appleton instantaneously jumps up from his seat, runs and catches her before she hits the ground. Someone calls for smelling salts. They start waving the smelling salts in her face. She wakes up, and the jury is just, oh, look at this. But it wasn't quite enough. He was convicted. He was convicted of outfitting ships for the slave trade, and he was sent back to the Charles Street jail. And I think I figured out where his prison cell was, and I have visited it twice, and it's now in a restaurant called Clink. And so if you go to the Charles Street jail for about $100, you can have lunch outside of Appleton's jail cell. It's one of those two doors there. And that was my computer when I was doing the research, and I pulled up the map and the picture of him and had a nice lunch there. So he's sitting back in jail, and he's awaiting sentencing. And this is the summer of 1862. And you see, Appleton was a very interesting person. He was fluent in at least 4 or 5 languages. He was very well traveled. He was very well read. He had these interesting parents. And the jailers thought he was an interesting guy to talk to. And so they would let him sit in the guard room while they would go off and do things. And then at night, he would let himself back into his cell. And then when they saw he had gone in, they would just lock the door behind him. And night after night, this is what would happen. He would hang out with them and then go back to sleep. Well, the night of September 10th, 1862, he's sitting in the guard room talking to the guards, and someone, a prisoner in another part of the prison, summons the guard to bring her some medicine. And so the guard goes and delivers the medicine, and when the guard comes back, Appleton is gone. And so the guard goes and looks in, and it appears that Appleton's asleep in his bed, so he closes the door and thinks nothing of it. Well, the next morning, they serve him breakfast, and they slide it under the grated door. And no one eats it. And 2 hours later, they come back and they bang on the door and they say, Appleton, eat your breakfast. And he doesn't move. And so they go and they get a guard, and they come and they unlock the door, and they go in, and Appleton had covered his bed with clothes and things, and then covered it with a blanket so that it looked like there was a man inside. And somehow that night, he escaped from prison. And he went from Boston down to Havana, Cuba. And he settled down there with his brother, Sidney, who was living in Havana. And I'll just do a quick aside. Sidney was a photographer, and he took a number of photographs in Havana, and this is one of them. And this was on eBay. And last October, I was doing this talk for a group out in Wisconsin. And I did this joke that I would always do where I would say, they don't pay me enough at CNU, so if anyone wants to buy me this photograph as a gift, I would be happy to take it. And then I was doing this talk again in November, and the guy who had invited me to speak in Wisconsin was also there in Gettysburg in November, and he said, Jonathan, I have a Christmas present for you. And I said, what is it? And he actually gave me this photograph. It was such a nice thing. So if Patrick Anderson is watching, he lives in Northern Virginia. Thank you for this incredible photo that Appleton Oaksmith's brother took in Havana. So he's living in Havana with his brother, and he recuperates his health. It takes a while for that to happen. And then by now, he is very bitter against the Union because he sees himself as having been mistreated. And so he becomes a Confederate blockade runner. And he starts running cotton between Havana and Galveston, Texas. And he has several very high-speed chases on the Gulf of Mexico, as high speed as they can be in 1863 and 64. On several occasions, he's almost captured. I won't tell you the details about them. They're in the book. But he, after one of these moments, makes it back to Havana, and he's living with his brother again. Now, while all this is going on, a Cuban slave trader gets caught slave trading against Spanish law, and he's about to be arrested, and the Cuban slave trader, a guy named Jose Agustin Arguelles, escapes from Havana and makes his way up to Manhattan. And so by the summer of 1864, here is the political and diplomatic situation. We've got a convicted American, Appleton Oaksmith, hiding out in Havana, and there's a Cuban slave trader hiding out in Manhattan. And the Spanish government wants their guy back, and the American government wants their guy back. And the problem was there was no extradition treaty between the United States and Spain in 1864. And so there was no legal way to make this swap. But the commanding general, Captain General he was called, of Cuba was an abolitionist. And he orchestrated things with the Spanish minister in Washington, D.C., who negotiated with Lincoln's Secretary of State. How about this? You kidnap our guy and send him back to us, and we'll kidnap your guy and send him back to you, and we'll just do a nice swap that way. And so the federal authorities went to New York City. They found Arguelles, they arrested him, and they sent him back to Cuba. And he got 19 years at hard labor for his crimes. Somehow, well, let me step back. It's September 1864, and Appleton is at his brother's house, and here's his brother, Sidney. And the Cuban police show up at Sidney's house somewhere between 11 p.m. and midnight, and they break through the front door, and they go inside, and they go through the house until eventually they find a man in bed. And they wake him up, and they say, "Come with us." And he says, "Who are you?" And they say, "Doesn't matter, you're coming with us, you're under orders." And he says, "I'm very sick. I can't come with you. I'm under doctor's orders to be in bed. I've had a lot of medicine. I can't get up." And they're having none of it. They drag him out of bed, and they keep ordering him out, and they get him outside of the house. And at that point, the Cuban police begin to wonder if they've got the right guy. And so two of the police officers go back into the house, and they find a servant, and they say, "Can you get us a photograph of Appleton Oaksmith?" And so the servant goes and gets a photo, and they bring it out, and they look at the photo, and then they look at the guy they've arrested, and they realize they've got his brother. They've got Sidney, not Appleton. Somehow Appleton had found out about this impending kidnapping plot, and he managed to escape. These two moments, Arguelles and the botched kidnapping of Appleton Oaksmith, made national headlines. And in fact, it led to debates in Lincoln's cabinet. The more conservative members and moderate members of Lincoln's cabinet were horrified that the Secretary of State would have a kidnapping plot like this. You see here the Attorney General and the Secretary of the Navy. The Attorney General said this. He said that he was much alarmed by this incident. And he speculated that Secretary of State Seward was led to the hazardous measure of very doubtful policy, at least if not clearly illegal, by his belief that it would be a capital hit to win the favor of the extreme anti-slavery men. And the Secretary of the Navy, Gideon Welles, said, "Seward sometimes does strange things, and I am inclined to believe he has committed one of those freaks which makes me constantly apprehensive of his acts." And from their perspective, they didn't think a slave trader should not be punished, but they worried about violating international and national law in the process of bringing someone to justice. Seward responded to this by saying that enemies of the human race don't have constitutional rights, and that he was justified in doing what he was doing. Well, what happened and I'll say Lincoln didn't touch this topic. He stayed silent on it until after the election of 1864. And then he came out publicly and said essentially the same thing as Seward, that people who violate human rights don't get certain constitutional protections. Well, what of Appleton Oaksmith? Now, he escaped from Havana, escaped arrest, evaded arrest, and made his way to Canada. And I mentioned to you that he had met his wife and they'd known each other for a mere 10 days before getting married, and they had a very rocky relationship. And he decided that he wanted to divorce her. And he found a way to do that. Believe it or not, in Indiana had very liberal divorce laws in the 1850s. And in Indiana, you could get a divorce for any reason you wanted to by mail. And so lawyers in East Coast cities would advertise their services. You want a divorce from your wife? Hire me, and I will cook up some paperwork that makes it look like you live in Indiana, and we'll forge the signatures and we'll get you divorced. And so somehow Appleton acquired a divorce against Isata, and this is the actual paperwork. I got it from the county courthouse in Indiana. And he divorced her without her even knowing. And then he married his cousin, Augusta, in Canada. He then takes his new wife / cousin and his children by his first wife, there's 3 of them, to England. And they settle in England. He calls for his first wife, who does not yet know she's only the first wife, to come to England. And she thinks she's being reunited with her husband and children. And when she gets there, he says, you know, we shouldn't be seen together in public. It might make people suspicious, so stay somewhere else, and we'll just meet at certain times. And during one of these meetings, he produces some paper and says, sign this or you'll never see the kids again. And not knowing what to do, she signs the document, and that officially ratifies the divorce. Now, while all this is going on, his mother is back in the United States working hard to get Lincoln to pardon, and then after Lincoln is killed, to get Andrew Johnson to pardon Appleton Oak Smith. And she goes to the White House and meets with President Johnson. And Johnson listened to her story and was on the verge of granting a pardon when the jilted ex-wife found out. And she rushed to the White House, met with Andrew Johnson, said, my ex-husband's a scoundrel, don't pardon him. And the extraordinary irony is that Andrew Johnson, the guy who's infamous for pardoning every ex-Confederate after the Civil War, refuses to pardon Appleton Oak Smith. And so Appleton remains in exile for another couple of years until 1872, when Ulysses S. Grant becomes convinced that he was innocent and grants a pardon. So at that point, Appleton returns to the United States. And by something of a fluke, he settles about 4 hours south of here, near Beaufort or Morehead City, North Carolina. He was walking down the street and he saw a land auction, and he thought, I'm going to help the auctioneer out. And so he put in a very low bid. And then the next day he's walking down the street and someone comes up to him and says, hey, you got to pay for that land you bought. And he says, what are you talking about? And he said, no one else bid on the land. And so Appleton paid for the land and would live near Morehead City for the rest of his life. He ran for politics for a state legislature in the mid-1870s. And believe it or not, he ran as an anti-Klan, pro-black civil rights, independent candidate. I don't know how to explain this. And I'll tell you something that's tragic for me as a historian. As I was writing this book, I was occasionally posting things online about what I was doing, and one of his great-great-granddaughters wrote to me, and she threatened to sue me for defaming her family name, and she said, I have a memoir that Appleton Oak Smith wrote, and I won't let you see it. And I thought, come on, like that might tell me how did he escape from jail, or why did he come to support black civil rights? I may never know the answer, and I certainly didn't know by the time I finished this book. But if you look at this photograph, and you can see some black members of the legislature here and right next to him, and here he is right there. And he's actually touching elbows with a black member of the legislature. And in the late 1870s, he actually traveled to New York City and gave a speech at the Cooper Union, which is an art institute, and he shared the stage with one of the most famous black Presbyterian ministers of the era, a guy named Henry Highland Garnett, and they both advocated for ending slavery around the world. A really incredible transformation. I call the book Shipwrecked because at least 12 people drown in the story. It's a very tragic story in a lot of ways, but it's also one I think that illuminates some of the most important moments of the middle period of our history. And with that, I have no idea how long I've talked, so I'll just turn things over to questions. Thank you so much for coming out today.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. If you have a question, please raise your hand and I'll bring you the mic. We need to use the mic so that we can capture the audio on our video recording. So, who's got a question? Anybody?
Up front.
Oh, there we go.
You said he picked up passengers with that first boat
Yeah.
and ended up in Rio de Janeiro.
Yeah.
What happened to them?
Oh, it's a great question. What happened to the
And then
passengers?
what happened to the boat?
I don't know what happened to the boat. The passengers were very upset with him as they went from San Francisco down to somewhere along the west coast of South America. I forget what city. And they were virtually on the verge of mutinying. And he kept telling them we're making good time, and they wouldn't listen to him. And we know all this because he kept a journal as he went. So he kept a daily account of everything that was happening. And so they get to some port town on the west coast of South America, and they get there, and he just orders all the passengers, get off the ship. And so he actually kicked them off the ship because he was so disgusted by them. And then the next day, all the other ships that had left San Francisco at the same time came in. And he basically says, yeah, I told you I was doing better than them. And in his journal, he recounted just what a good sailor he was in his mind for having beat out the other boats from San Francisco. So he kicked them off the ship, interestingly enough.
And another question?
Yeah, in the back.
I may have missed something, but it didn't sound like you made him to be a bad guy. And I don't understand what happened with the granddaughter or the great-granddaughter in the lawsuit. Did she just go away?
With the lawsuit?
Didn't she say that she was going to sue you?
Oh, yeah. So far, nothing's come of that. But if there are any lawyers in the room, I'd like to get your card afterwards. So one thing I didn't mention, but I will here, and then I'll talk about I'll address some of the parts of your question too. So Elizabeth Oakes Smith, her birth name was Elizabeth Oakes Prince, and she married this guy named Seba Smith. And for some reason, we're not sure exactly why, either it was her first wave feminism or she thought Smith was too bland of a last name, but for some reason, she got the New York State legislature to change the last names of all of her sons. And she smushed together her maiden middle name, Oakes, and her husband's surname, Smith, and just made up the last name, Oakesmith. And so some members of the family who are alive today are very sensitive about this, because if you Google the name Oakesmith, almost everything you find is about slave trading. And so they're very so the person who emailed me and essentially threatened to sue me, she's very sensitive about her family's last name. Now, there are other members of the family who are very open to and want to learn the family history. Now, I was really torn when writing the book exactly how to deal with Appleton and what he did. Because, as I alluded to, he was charged with outfitting ships for the slave trade, which means that what the prosecutor and the marshal did was they went on board and they looked at, what does he have? Does it look like he's going on a whaling voyage, or does it look like he's going on a slaving voyage? And they believed it looked like he was going on a slaving voyage. He argued a typical whaling voyage in the 19th century would be 3 years. And his response was, no, I'm not going on a 3-year voyage. We just wanted to hunt a couple whales and then come back and use it in the fish oil factory. So he claimed innocence his whole life. His mother obviously believed he was innocent. And the prosecutor and the jury were not convinced. And in a sense, he was caught too soon. It wasn't like Nathaniel Gordon, who was caught with 897 people on board. He was caught with various casks of water and quantities of meat and tools and implements, and that's what they used to try to successfully prosecute him. So in the book, the way I try to write it is almost in a journalistic way, where you read it and you see the story unfold as people at the time would have seen it unfold. And so you see the prosecutor and the arguments that he makes, and you see the defense and the strategy they have and the arguments they make. That said, I think that Appleton, he certainly was a problematic character, as the story of his divorce makes clear. And so I'll just tell you, one of the things that I was very proud of in the book, and this is such a minor thing, but it's kind of a typical historian thing, Wikipedia had his birthday wrong. And I figured out the day he was born. He was born March 22nd, which also happens to be my wife's birthday. And so I closed my acknowledgments by saying, my wife Lauren and mother-in-law Lee read an early version of the manuscript and offered helpful suggestions. For 15 years and counting, Lauren has been the best companion I could have hoped for. She shares a birthday with Appleton Oaksmith, but none of his disreputable characteristics. So he certainly was a problematic guy. Whether or not I do not believe he was slave trading in the early 1850s with the Battle of the Congo. If anything, the Portuguese may have tried to force him into a slave trading voyage, which actually happened. There were a lot of men who would get on a ship and head out to sea under an idea that they were on a certain type of voyage, and it was only after they got to sea or got to the west coast of Africa that the people in charge of the ship would say, hey, we're on a slaving voyage. You have two choices. You can either help us and make a lot of money, or you can stay on the west coast of Africa, which would mean certain death. And so it was not unheard of for people to get swept into the slave trade against their will because they were duped into it. And so it's quite possible that the Portuguese who went with him may have tried to force him to do that had they not been attacked and had the British then not intervened. But I don't think he set sail on that one to be involved in a slave trading voyage. If he had, I don't think he would have allowed the British onto his ship. And I went through the records at the British National Archives in Kew in the UK, and the ship, one of the two ships that boarded and went aboard his ship, had caught a slave trader a week earlier. So we know that they were doing their job and able to catch people and turn them in if they caught them. Whether or not he was doing it at the beginning of the Civil War, I just don't know. And he doesn't look good, but in a sense, he was caught before he actually was successful at doing anything.
Another question?
Oh, there's one up here. All right, go to the back first since you're there, and then up here.
I've seen graphs or whatever, that the major amount of slave trading was actually between the west coast of Africa and Brazil.
Yes.
Were the Americans, like all these loads and loads of holier-than-thou people in Rhode Island, involved in the African to Brazilian slave trade?
Yes. So the largest slave trade goes to Brazil until 1850, and then in 1850, Brazil shuts down its slave trade, and then the bulk of it goes to Cuba in the 1850s and into the 1860s. Americans were involved in that. So I don't know the numbers, but a lot of those ships were built in New England or in Baltimore, and they were often captained by Americans. Very few, after 1808, very few ships actually come into the United States. There are a few very famous ones, and some come into the United States as late as 1860. The Clotilde, which was discovered, I believe, recently, or they think it's the ship, was down off the Gulf Coast, I think in Alabama, and there were some brought into South Carolina, but you are correct. The vast majority of it went to Brazil until 1850 and then to Cuba.
I think you had time for about one more. Had one up here?
Yeah.
Boring, anticlimactic question for a final. How is it that the Department of the Interior was involved in the Gordon prosecution?
It's a great question. So the Interior Department wasn't involved in the prosecution itself. There was no Justice Department yet. That's not created till 1870. So it's Lincoln's prosecutor, what we would today call a U.S. attorney, which at the time they called a district attorney, who reported to the Attorney General. So he's in charge of the prosecution. The U.S. Marshal, who reports to the Secretary of State, is in charge of the imprisonment and the detainment of the prisoner. The Interior Department was put in charge of the broader effort to destroy the slave trade. And so I don't know why exactly Lincoln chose to make the Secretary of the Interior in charge of that, but that was, maybe there was no National Park Service at the time. Maybe they were the least busy with everything else going on during the Civil War, and Lincoln thought, hey, Caleb Smith, I'll give you something to work on. So it could be as simple as that. I'm not sure exactly. Oh, it's a great question.
I think with that, we're going to need to wrap it up. I want to thank Dr. White for a really interesting and informative presentation.
Thanks.
Thank you. And if I may have another 60 seconds, I've got some very short announcements to make. As I mentioned earlier, Professor White will be available for sale and signing of this book and some of his others downstairs in the lobby as soon as he can get there. The York County Historical Committee's compiled history of Yorktown and a companion copy of the African American history of Yorktown to 1808 are available for sale or for order right outside the door here. $20, dirt cheap for what you get. We'd like for you to also invite you to visit the York County Historical Museum, which is located in the basement of this building. Not open right now, but when you get an opportunity, it's one of the real hidden gems of York County if you have an opportunity to go visit it. And I'd also like to invite you to our next lecture, which will be March the 10th, titled Lafayette and the American Revolution. The Marquis de Lafayette will be portrayed by Mark Snyder, who has portrayed Lafayette on numerous occasions across the country. And last, if you'd like to, excuse me, if you'd like to receive notice of upcoming lectures, you can get on our mailing list by putting your your email address on a slip of paper outside the door here and drop it in the box, and we'll add you to our mailing list announcing upcoming lectures. Again, thank you very much for coming, and hope you enjoyed it.